Welcome to this week's faith-affirming finding.
Welcome to Faith Affirming Findings, a podcast dedicated to sharing with you
the incredible discoveries from the field of biblical archaeology.
These findings will strengthen your faith, affirm the historicity of Scripture, and provide you with unique insights into the culture and background of the Bible.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Today, I'm recording from one of the classrooms of Dallas Theological Seminary where I teach in the Bible Exposition Department. If you would like to learn more about how you could be a student at Dallas Theological Seminary, visit us at dts.edu. Now, to today's faith-affirming finding. In last week's podcast, I shared about one of my favorite locations in the entire Holy Land, the Tel Dan. And I discussed all the amazing archaeological artifacts discovered there. But there's one more incredible discovery at Tel Dan. I saved the best for last. The discovery that I'm speaking of is the House of David inscription. It is called the House of David inscription because it references the House of David or the dynasty of David. It is also known by another name, Tel Dan inscription, because it was discovered at Tel Dan. The largest portion of this inscription was discovered in 1993 by Avraham Biran near the Israeli Gate, which I discussed in last week's podcast. A second and third fragment was also discovered a year later. So 3 fragments of this inscription have been discovered in total and have been pieced together. The right side is the largest fragment, and on the left side you can see 2 additional smaller fragments. The top portion and bottom portion of this inscription has yet to be uncovered. The entire inscription would have been approximately 12.5 inches wide and 13.5 inches high. It is dated to the 9th century BC, which fits nicely with the dating of the biblical description of the events recorded on it. This stele is what is called a victory stele. It's written in Aramaic on a stone slab. A victory stele was employed by a king to brag about his military accomplishments. This stele describes the military conquest of Hazael of Aram. Aram is an empire north of Israel and Judah. On this inscription, Hazael bragged that he killed many kings and thousands of horsemen and thousands of chariots. On it, he also references Jehoram, son of Ahab, and Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, from the House of David. A partial translation of this reconstructed inscription reads, I slew 70 kings who harnessed thousands of chariots and thousands of horsemen. I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David, and I set their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation. This House of David inscription affirms the historicity of Scripture, including details like the Battle of Ramoth Gilead, which is recorded in 2 Kings 8, and we know occurred in around 841 BC. It also affirms that the kingdom of Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms. This reconstructed inscription also affirms the historicity of many characters recorded in Scripture, including Hazael, king of Aram. See 2 Kings 8, 28 and 29. Aram is in modern-day Syria. The reconstructed inscription also references King Ahab of Israel, King Jehoram of Israel, King Jehoram of Judah, and King Ahaziah of Judah. And most important of all, this discovery was the first extra-biblical evidence, that is, evidence outside of the Bible itself, that affirms the historical character known as King David. No reconstruction is needed for this portion of the fragments. It is as clear as day of the house of David. The House of David Stele is an exciting find because it has silenced the critics. For years, many scholars who do not regard the Bible as a reliable historical document have denied the existence of King David. They instead argued that the stories concerning David were merely legends and that David was a fictitious character. In fact, one skeptical scholar from the University of Sheffield infamously wrote as late as 1994, "I'm not the only scholar who suspects that the figure of King David is about as historical as King Arthur." But the reference to the House of David recognizes that there was a kingly line, a dynasty that came from the line of David. And if there was a kingly line from the line of David, then there must have also been a king named David. Today, there's a consensus amongst archaeologists and biblical scholars, both conservative and liberal alike, that King David was a real human being who existed and reigned around 1000 BC. You can see the House of David inscription today on display at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The House of David inscription once again affirms the historicity of Scripture and silenced the skeptics. And that is your faith-affirming finding for the week. I hope that you'll join us again next week, because on next week's Faith-Affirming Findings podcast, we will discuss another incredible archaeological find known as Sennacherib's Prism. Don't forget to click on the like button, subscribe to this podcast, and leave a comment or question, and share this episode on your social media outlets so that this podcast becomes more accessible to those looking for faith-affirming programming. And as always, we'll include additional links at the bottom of the YouTube channel in the description to this video for you to learn more about Tel Dan and the House of David Stele. See you next time.
Faith Affirming Findings podcast is a listener-supported podcast devoted to affirming your faith in the reliability of Scripture and illuminating your understanding of Scripture.
If you would like to help sponsor the Faith Affirming Finding podcast,
You can make a tax-deductible donation of any amount, large or small,
at faithaffirmingfindings.com. That's faithaffirmingfindings.com, and click on the Give tab.
We hope you'll join us again next week for another exciting Faith Affirming Finding.